And good evening. Democrats facing a harsh reality tonight after President Joe Biden delivered on their worst fears during last night's brutal debate. The 90-minute face-off between President Biden and former President Trump was at times straight up difficult to watch. On arguably the biggest political stage, former President Trump's slung falsehoods while Biden, in a raspy, low-energy voice, stumbled over his words. But it was Biden looking lost on camera and losing track of his thoughts that sent Democrats into a panic. In the middle of the debate, Biden's staff announcing he had a cold, but the damage was already done. The calls growing louder than ever before about if Biden could be replaced on the presidential ticket at this point in time. We'll explain that possibility in a moment. Those calls now even being echoed by the New York Times editorial board. This just in an op-ed just released, the editorial board writing in part, there is no reason for the party to risk the stability and security of the country by forcing voters to choose between Mr. Trump's deficiencies and those of Mr. Biden. It's too big a bet to simply hope Americans will overlook or discount Mr. Biden's age and infirmity that they see with their own eyes. Today, President Biden back on the campaign trail, visiting New York City's LGBTQ landmark Stonewall Inn alongside Elton John. And earlier in the day, Biden looking and sounding much different from last night.
Folks, I give you my word as a Biden, I would not be running again if I didn't believe with all my heart and soul I can do this job. Because quite frankly, the stakes are too high.
Looking and sounding like a completely different candidate, a night and day contrast. But what it all comes down to is the voters, many of whom are now forced to reconcile with the state of the 2024 race.
We're doomed. This is the best we got.
I think this debate was bad for our country. I think, we're in a very difficult spot as a nation.
A lot of those voters laughing, but there's really nothing funny about the state of this race. More than 51 million watched last night's debate, but that wasn't the highest watched ever. It's not even record-setting. To put this in perspective, the 2016 debate between Hillary Clinton and former President Trump brought in a record 84 million viewers. We're breaking it all down tonight, including where we go from here and if we think there will be a second debate. But first, NBC's Gabe Gutierrez starts us off.
Facing panic within the Democratic Party. Today at a raucous rally in North Carolina, a defiant President Biden declared he's staying in the race.
When you get knocked down, you get back up.
While acknowledging his debate performance that many Democrats panned as a disaster.
I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth. I know right from wrong. And I know how to do this job.
Today's event, a stark contrast from the night before. Supporters here sticking by him.
I would love to have seen that person at the debate last night.
Is President Biden the best person to lead the Democratic Party right now?
Who else is there?
Meanwhile, at his rally in Virginia, former President Trump taking a victory lap.
The question every voter should be asking themselves today is not whether Joe Biden can survive a 90-minute debate performance, but whether America can survive 4 more years of crooked Joe Biden in the White House.
All of it coming after last night's debate, where the 81-year-old president hoped to put to rest questions about his mental acuity. Instead, he fueled even more. With a raspy voice the campaign blamed on a cold, he repeatedly lost his train of thought.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare,
even muddling this answer on one of his key issues, abortion rights.
I supported Roe v. Wade, which had 3 trimesters. The first time is between the woman and the doctor. Second time is between the doctor and an extreme situation. The third time is between the doctor, between the woman and the state.
Former President Trump took advantage.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
But President Biden did deliver some sharp attacks against Mr. Trump, branding him a convicted felon and getting personal.
How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, for doing a whole range of things, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
Give you a minute, sir.
I didn't have sex with a porn star.
Former President Trump, appearing more measured to start, became more aggressive with his attacks as the debate wore on.
Did you fire anybody? Did you fire anybody that's on the border that's allowed us to have the worst border in the history of the world?
But he also repeated many false claims, including that most Americans supported overturning Roe v. Wade when polls show otherwise.
You had Roe v. Wade, and everybody wanted to get it back to the states, everybody, without exception.
And the lie that there was widespread fraud in the 2020 election.
The fraud and everything else was ridiculous.
He also refused to give a clear answer on whether he'd accept the results this November.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely.
After the debate, Republicans went on the attack, saying the night validated their concerns about the president's fitness for office.
We have been discussing here for a long, long time that President Biden is not up to the job. I mean, everyone sees that clearly.
The Biden campaign doing damage control. A source familiar with the discussions tells NBC News staffers considered pulling Vice President Kamala Harris from scheduled post-debate interviews. But she said she wanted to do them to defend the president.
Yes, there was a slow start, but it was a strong finish.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez joins us tonight from Raleigh, North Carolina, where the president had his rally. So, Gabe, that last piece of reporting you had in your story there is quite stunning, that there was actual consideration not to have the vice president, Kamala Harris, go out there on the news shows and defend the president. What more do we know about that? And I'm sort of fascinated by it because we had that moment yesterday after the debate. There was about a 20-minute lag where the Biden surrogates after the debate didn't pour into the spin room like the Trump ones did, and it was unclear why. And then finally they did come in and start to defend the president. But clearly there was a shakeup within the campaign right after that debate.
Well, Tom, clearly the Biden team was really trying to figure this out, figure out their message in real time. In fact, there was a time at the start of the debate for a good half hour or so when we had already heard the president's raspy voice when we were asking what seemed to be wrong. It took them at least a half hour or so before they blamed it on a cold, as you heard there in the piece. But this is something that is reverberating throughout the entire Biden campaign and even the White House. Two senior administration officials today, they're not sugarcoating it. They acknowledge that he had a bad night, but the campaign is arguing that one bad night should not define the entire campaign. And this all comes as President Biden is heading to a fundraiser tonight as well as tomorrow. But we are hearing that there are some nervous Democratic donors. Tom.
And then, Gabe, we had that bit of breaking news off the top, right? I guess breaking in the sense in progressive circles that the New York Times editorial page, which has been, I would argue, maybe the newspaper that has defended the Biden administration the most, now calling for him to step aside. How is that being received by the White House and the campaign? Are they responding?
Well, that just broke a few moments ago, Tom, but no response yet from the White House or the campaign. But I can tell you that their response to these growing calls for President Biden to leave the race has really evolved throughout the day, because early on in the day, there were TV pundits that were making those calls, as well as a few writers. But the Biden campaign was making the case that these were all, most of these calls were anonymous. We hadn't heard any elected officials come out and ask for President Biden to leave the race. But late today, yes, that editorial from the New York Times saying that President Biden is not the man he was 4 years ago, certainly caused a lot of conversations, nervous conversations in the Democratic Party, Tom.
And then, Gabe, I think I have a bigger question for you tonight, right? And that is, how does the White House and the campaign explain the two Joe Bidens we see sometimes, right? You see him on nights like the State of the Union. You see him like this afternoon in North Carolina, and he has energy. He's able to deliver his message. And then you watch last night's debate, and it almost seems like there's two different people there. Do they have an explanation for the American people on what's going on?
Look, and a lot of voters are thinking that. We spoke with one voter today that earlier in the piece you heard that she wished she would have seen the President Biden that she saw today. She wished she would have seen him yesterday. Now, the White House is saying, the campaign is saying that this has happened to President Biden before, that he's been counted out, and they expect him to come back from this one. But you're right, Tom. There is a huge disconnect in what we saw yesterday from what we saw today. He seemed much more relaxed today. He was in front of a crowd and he was fired up. He was there's a lot of questions right now about just what his preparation was at Camp David, whether he may have been overworked or whether he just didn't like the format or just wasn't prepared for that debate. It's really causing a lot of questions, frankly, among some of the voters we're speaking with, Tom.
Gabe Gutierrez leading us off tonight, and as we were talking with Gabe, we actually got a response from the campaign, the Biden campaign, on the New York Times editorial board calling on President Biden to step aside. Here's what they write. They say the last time Joe Biden lost the New York Times editorial board's endorsement, it turned out pretty well for him. Okay, amid the fallout from President Biden's debate performance last night, calls from within the party for Biden to step aside growing louder. One Democratic lawmaker telling NBC News, quote, "This was like a champion boxer who gets in the ring past his prime and needs his corner to throw in the towel." And in the spin room last night, top Democrats showing frustration.
If I sat here and said that this was the president's best performance, then the people would think that I'm less than truthful.
You don't turn your back because of one performance. What kind of party does that?
He had one thing he had to accomplish, and that was reassure America that he was up to the job at his age. And he failed at that tonight.
Late today, a forceful show of support from former President Obama, posting on X, "Bad debate nights happen. Trust me, I know. But does this go beyond just a bad debate performance?" That's what we're asking tonight. That's what some Democrats are saying to NBC's Jonathan Allen and Megan Leibowitz. One source saying definitively, quote, "There is no coming back from this disaster." Here with more of their reporting from Democrats, senior national politics reporter Jonathan Allen, a good friend of Top Story, and politics reporter Megan Leibowitz. Thank you both for being here tonight. John, I want to dig a little deeper into your reporting. Is that the sentiment, that there's no coming back from this? Are you still hearing this as sort of the day progressed?
Yeah, there's certainly some of that sentiment within the Democratic Party. I've heard that from other Democrats. Obviously, we reported that last night with a number of sources, including lawmakers, Democratic operatives, and strategists. At the same time, it is not the majority of Democrats I've spoken to. I'd say there are three buckets. There's the one bucket that says Joe Biden needs to drop out. Like the New York Times editorial board just said. There's a bucket of Democrats who say this was one bad debate performance, as you heard Governor Gavin Newsom say. And then I think there's a third group, including a couple people I spoke to today, donors, operatives, who say they want to see what the polling looks like a week or two from now and see if the bottom drops out of Biden's polling, particularly among Democrats, who he needs to reassure in order to have his base show up. So I think at the moment there's at least going to be a little bit of a pause in some of the calls. We haven't heard elected lawmakers on the record yet, elected officials really on the record yet. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But the Democratic Party is split right now over the question of whether their nominee can continue, and that is not a place Joe Biden wants to be.
John, you mentioned the New York Times, and if you go on the website right now and you look on the right-hand side, you see 5 editorials back-to-back, 5 op-eds, right, starting with that first editorial. "To serve his country, President Biden should leave the race. Kamala Harris could win this election. Let her. How the Democrats should replace Biden. Is it too late? 4 writers on what Democrats should do about Biden. Joe Biden is a good man and a good president. He must bow out of the race." I point that out, John, because the New York Times, which is arguably the most powerful, most influential newspaper, I would say, maybe in the world, definitely in the United States, has the editorial page has defended President Biden and his policies. And today you have this. I mean, and again, it's just a newspaper. They have no control over the Democratic Party or the White House or this campaign. But what does this mean?
Yeah, they are, even though they don't have control over the Democratic Party or the White House, they are the most important voice for progressives in terms of their editorial page, their op-ed, and their in-house editorials, the editorial board, like the one that just came out. So this is a, sort of a thought leader for the left, and that's an important marker for Biden now. You saw Barack Obama come out in defense of him today. You saw Bill Clinton, former president, come out in defense of him. I think the Biden camp is hopeful that those voices will outweigh the influence of the Times and its op-ed writers that you just showed all those clips from. But they are struggling right now to figure out how to respond to this. The campaign's response that the last time Joe Biden lost the New York Times editorial board endorsement, it came out well for him. Well, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison, because the last time was when there was a dual endorsement of Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren 4.5 years ago in the Democratic primary. The reason this matters so much is that we're talking about a general election, and this voice that is an influencer on the left is coming out against it.
Megan, I want to get you into this conversation, right? Despite those calls to step down, President Biden was adamant today about staying in this race. And you have to really think, right? He's fought his whole life to get to this point. He is the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief. Why would he step aside? And is there anybody that could change his mind?
No, that's a great question, Tom, and thanks for having me. The short answer is there are very few people who could actually make an impact on how President Biden is viewing this race. That would likely come down to President Barack Obama, sources say, or his wife, the First Lady, his closest confidant. But as you and John mentioned earlier, President Obama is already backing President Biden in this. He posted to X, and he acknowledged, though, that this was not President Biden's finest performance. But he also alluded to his own presidential debate, referring, of course, to the one in 2012, his first face-off against Mitt Romney, which was widely panned as not his finest performance. And so Biden world, his closest allies, seem to really be circling around him and continuing to stand by him as he continues to face these criticisms from people like the New York Times editorial board and politicians and strategists who are deeply concerned about his ability to continue.
John, Republicans have been sounding the alarm about the president's mental fitness, and the White House has pushed back adamantly on this, right? Yes, there have been videos that have been altered, cheap fakes, deep fakes, whatever you want to call them, right? Those videos exist. They are pushed out by the right. But there are also realities where the president clearly has lost his place. He's frozen. We saw last night's debate. The special counsel brought up his memory, right? And so my question is this: is the White House now losing credibility when they are asked about the president's physical fitness, his mental fitness, I should say, and they're asked by the White House press corps about this, and they push back, and they actually push false narratives at this point? Is the conversation or the debate over the president's mental fitness, is the verdict back, right? Is the case closed, or do you think we're going to keep having this conversation over the next few months?
Yeah, Tom, fortunately for everyone, I'm not a doctor, so I can't speak to his actual mental fitness. But what I can tell you is the White House has been denying what I think a lot of the public sees with its eyes for a very long time, and what was very evident yesterday, which is that the president doesn't have the fastball that he used to have, that he does get lost in his speech, that he does seem to forget where he is in terms of the argument that he's making. And I think the White House does lose credibility when they tell people that they should believe the White House and not their lying eyes, so to speak.
Megan, where does the campaign, do you think, go from here? How does Joe Biden bounce back, and how have those incumbents bounced back from bad debates that you've researched?
Right. So there is definitely a history of incumbents underperforming in their first presidential debate of the general election season. From sources who I've talked to, former advisors, strategists, historians, they say that it comes from this place of being insulated in the Oval Office, hearing, yes, Mr. President, for 4 years. But this time seems to be different, is what they're telling me now after last night's debate performance. I had one Democratic strategist refer to President Biden's performance as a, quote, biblical implosion. I had another historian describe his performance to me as it seeming like President Biden was cast adrift and unable to swim. So there certainly is concern as to how this debate for an incumbent does measure up historically. The folks that I talked with seem to think that it was a worse performance than incumbents have done historically. So the question now becomes, will President Biden listen to these criticisms and bow out of the race? But right now, there's certainly no indication that he has any plans to do that.
Megan Leibowitz, John Allen, part of our NBCNews.com political team. They've been doing some phenomenal reporting in the lead up to this debate and throughout this campaign. You can read their stuff there, guys. guys, thank you so much. For more on the fallout from last night's debate, I want to bring in our political pros tonight. Kelly Robinson, she's president of the Human Rights Campaign and a Biden campaign surrogate, and Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and a former senior advisor to the Tim Scott campaign. We thank you both for being here. Kelly, I'm going to start with you, right? The New York Times editorial board asking for President Biden to step aside. There are 5 op-eds on the New York Times website right now. People who have close relationships with the president, who have defended him, now asking for him to step aside. You hear that from Democrats as well in reporting across the board in America tonight. Will President Biden stay on this ticket?
Look, everybody needs to take a breath. Yes, last night was not his night. Okay, we can all acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, we got to look at the last 3.5 years of the performance of this president. My community that I represent is the LGBTQ plus community, and there has never been a more pro-equality administration than the one that we have right now. Him running for office, him winning this campaign, it's not just about the difference between 2 candidates. It's about 2 different visions for our country, 2 different futures for my family and for my kid. There is too much at stake for us to be distracted right now.
Well,
the American people, the American voters.
No, and I get that. If it's about
to hear
2
directly
different
from the candidates.
If it's about 2 different visions and 2 different futures, then it's not about a single candidate, right? And if Democrats want an option, if they want a choice, if they want someone else, wouldn't that be better to execute that vision and that future?
Primary voters have already made their choice. They voted for Joe Biden. And here we are at a time where they need to get the chance to actually hear from them. And what I heard yesterday, I saw Donald Trump directly lie to the American people, lie over and over and over again. I saw him evade questions about whether or not he would support the outcomes of a fair election. I heard him not renege what happened on January 6th. So let's be clear. We saw a debate happen last night, but there's no debate about who is the president that we need in this country right now. That's Joe Biden.
Matt, I want to put up some a flash poll from CNN that they did before and after this debate. If we can put it up on the screen now for our viewers here. So these were debate expectations and the results, right? This was before the debate. 55% for Trump, thinking he would win the debate, 45% for Joe Biden. So he came in with the bar low. This is what happened afterwards. Again, this is a flash poll. After the debate, 67% for Trump, 33% for Joe Biden. I got to be honest with you, Matt. You would think President Trump's numbers would be higher. They should be higher with the way the debate is being covered and the onslaught that President Biden has taken, all the incoming. Is it a case that this wasn't a great debate for Donald Trump? It was just a really bad debate for President Biden?
I think it was certainly a very bad debate for President Biden. I also think, for better or worse, you know where you stand with Donald Trump. And I think a lot of that will color how you view a debate performance, for instance, or whether or not you're going to vote for him. And look, I was actually honestly impressed. There was obviously more prep done by Donald Trump than I think him and his team let on in a positive way. He came off a lot better than I expected. And, look, I think you hit it on the head with John.
Explain that point, though. Wait, hold on. Explain. Okay, I get that maybe he was a little bit more disciplined in the beginning, but how was he more prepped?
More prepped. So, for example, a couple of things. He always stared straight at the camera, did not look at Joe Biden, didn't take the bait in a couple issues, and for as much as possible, we talked about this Monday, Tom, steered the conversation back to 3 main points, which he's winning on: immigration, the economy, and crime, as much as possible, and didn't try. And I also say this: his answer on abortion, whatever you think about it, it was one of the best I've seen this whole year in terms of answers during a debate about abortion.
Kelly, I'm going to ask our fine director here, Brett Holy, to fire up a soundbite from David Axelrod, of course, one of the political gurus, one of the architects of Barack Obama's victories and his reelection. Here's what he said after the debate. Let's listen.
If, for whatever reason, there's a change at the top of the ticket, you guys are in trouble with Donald Trump, because the guy who was up there tonight is not a guy who's going to inspire people. He did not show in any way that he has changed from the guy who people have a very positive opinion of for a lot of good reason.
Kelly, what do you say to that?
Like, people already fired Donald Trump in the last election cycle. And, you said it yourself, right? For better or worse, we know who Donald Trump is. And I can say it is for worse. I'm standing outside of Stonewall Inn, where we're celebrating about 55 years since that historic uprising launched the modern LGBTQ plus movement. We have made so much progress. If Donald Trump is president, he's already shown you the court that he put in place that would overturn Roe v. Wade. We would see our rights rolled back even further, not just the rights of the last 10 years or 20 years, but the rights of the last several hundred. What's happening in front of us, this is existential. We have got to show up for our community and for our families, and we owe the American voters the grace of letting them have the chance to hear directly from these candidates and understand their policy positions, because this is not a choice. There is a stark difference between rolling us back like Donald Trump wants to do and bringing us forward and giving us all greater rights and access like Joe Biden has proven himself to do.
Matt, there were times when President Biden could knock former President Trump off kilter, and the debate took some strange turns, right? Here's one moment where I think sort of the debate went off the rails.
I just won 2 club championships, not even senior, 2 regular club championships. To do that, you have to be quite smart, and you have to be able to hit the ball a long way, and I do it. He doesn't do it. He can't hit a ball 50 yards.
Matt, voters want to know about inflation. They want to know about the wars overseas. They want to know about what's happening with immigration. He's talking about winning club championships at Mar-a-Lago. What are we talking about here?
I mean, yeah, it was 2 baby boomers talking about their golf game. It was honestly probably the most relatable part of the entire night. It got a little silly at the end. I will grant you that. But I think at the first half hour, I think it was, and I'll give you also credit to CNN, they covered a lot of ground. Child care, too. They covered a lot of issues that I think often don't get a lot of time at these debates. But the first half hour, I thought, again, when they talked about immigration, abortion, and one other thing that I thought was also very interesting, too, right? Biden was whiffing on his easiest pitches, abortion January 6th in his closing statement, things that should be absolutely easy for him. The closing statement should be memorized, period. And when he started veering off and talking about illegal immigration, that was the first time for me, like, wait a minute, something is not right here. That was, in my mind, really the tell that Biden was not where he should have been.
Kelly, what did you think of the debate and the format that they had, right? There's been some questions about the no real-time fact-checking and the mics being cut off. In the end, was that a good platform for President Biden?
Look, I think it was a more civilized debate format than what we've seen, happen in previous years in different debates. But at the end of the day, the fact-checking is so important because people are looking to them to tell the truth. And you've got one candidate up there that's not committed to that, not committed to even trying to do that. And again, it all comes back to me that at this point, voters have a serious decision in front of them, a serious decision that's going to have impact for so many generations to come. They deserve to hear the truth. And that's what we need to make sure happens. And although the performance yesterday, was a little tough for Joe Biden, look at him today. Look at him in North Carolina on fire. Look at him in New York when he was preaching over here at Stonewall. He was on fire. That's the Joe Biden that folks are voting for, and that's the Joe Biden people need to see more of.
All right, Kelly, we appreciate you. Matt Gorman, thanks so much for being here. Always a pleasure on Top Story. Now to some news from the Supreme Court. The justice is handing down 3 huge decisions, including the possibility of resentencing or retrials for those involved in the January 6th riots. NBC's Laura Jarrett explains why.
Tonight, 3 colossal decisions with far-reaching consequences. The High Court narrowing who can be charged under a federal law that dates back to Enron, more recently used to prosecute more than 200 people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. The justice is opening the door now to possible resentencing or even retrials for roughly a few dozen still behind bars. At least one judge moving quickly today, asking prosecutors to weigh in on next steps with a handful of defendants. Former President Trump likely not impacted by today's ruling, nor most other people who were charged with other crimes related to January 6th. The presumptive GOP nominee still fighting his case, once again coming to the defense of the rioters at last night's debate.
What they've done to some people that are so innocent, you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
In another major case, the High Court knocking down a 40-year-old rule of its own making that required judges to defer to federal agencies when interpreting vague laws passed by Congress. That practice, known as the Chevron framework, long targeted by conservatives who've argued it gives unelected bureaucrats too much power. The decision likely to prompt a rush of lawsuits challenging regulations on everything from food safety to the environment. Also today, the court's conservative majority upholding laws banning people experiencing homelessness from sleeping outdoors, finding no violation of the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, drawing a sharp dissent from the liberals, with Justice Sotomayor writing, "Sleep is a biological necessity, not a crime." Ahead of the court's decision, NBC News' Liz Kreutz met with Helen Cruz. She's racked up thousands in fines under a local ordinance in Grants Pass, Oregon, prohibiting encampments in city parks.
You can't get any more hopeless than you already are when you're out here.
And Tom, the High Court has saved perhaps the most consequential case for last. We now know on Monday the justices will issue a decision on the issue of whether or not the former president is immune from prosecution. Back to you.
Okay, Laura, we thank you for that. Still ahead tonight, 2 officers who responded to the Uvalde mass shooting arrested and charged. Prosecutors saying their actions led to the failed police response as that massacre unfolded. The mother of one of those young victims joins Top Story next about why their indictments are still not enough. Plus, a powerful 7.2 magnitude earthquake rocking Peru's coast. The tsunami threat just lowered. And a 220-pound fish caught less than 100 miles from Manhattan. Look at that thing. Why experts say this catch is so rare. Stay with us. We're back now with a major development in the 2022 deadly school shooting at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. Peter Arredondo, who was the school district's police chief on that day, now charged in connection to the shooting that left 19 children and 2 teachers dead. He's facing 10 state felony counts of abandoning and endangering a child. The indictment saying his actions ultimately delayed the law enforcement response. Body cam video, you may remember, showing Arredondo and other officers just standing in the hallway as the gunman was inside a classroom with students and teachers. More than 70 minutes passing before the gunman was confronted and finally killed. The Uvalde School Board fired Arredondo months after the shooting, but parents of the victims have been calling for him to face criminal charges. And joining Top Story tonight is Kimberly Mata-Rubio, whose 10-year-old daughter, Lexi, was killed in that mass shooting. Kimberly, it's good to speak with you again, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight here on Top Story. My first question is pretty simple. What is your reaction to this indictment?
I am not surprised by the information that accompanied Pete Arredondo's indictment. I am, however, having a hard time processing Adrian Gonzalez's indictment, as his information says that he arrived at the school and could have encountered and stopped the shooter before he even went into the building.
So, Kimberly, we just introduced that news that you just mentioned there about Officer Adrian Gonzalez. Talk to me more about that indictment as well. He was indicted along with the former police chief, but remind our viewers from what you've just read in this indictment and what sort of stunned you.
Absolutely. So both are charged with endangering a child. However, Pete Arredondo's indictment only lists the survivors because he failed to properly go in to stop the shooter and evacuate those students, while Adrian Gonzalez's list all the children, including Lexi. And again, it's really hard to process that 21 people could have gone home that day had Adrian Gonzalez done his job.
Are you angry today? Because, you know, one of the questions we wanted to ask you is that do you feel that justice is being served in some small way here, or is this new indictment sort of bringing more frustration and bringing back bad memories?
It, of course, is bringing bad memories. We try to stay extremely busy, and every time there's new developments, it definitely takes its toll. This isn't justice. Justice would be convictions, and I am disappointed that there aren't more state officers listed. However, we knew that was a long shot.
Why do you think it's taken so long to get to this point? You guys have been out there in the forefront. You have suffered more than anyone else in this country, and you guys have been asking for this, and it's taken so long. 2 years now, more than 2 years if you think about this. So why do you think it's taken this long?
I think that it's taken this long because there were 376 officers to review, lots of evidence to review. I wished it would have been sooner because it has definitely taken its toll on those of us that are grieving in our grieving process.
Has Arredondo, has Officer Adrian Gonzalez, have they ever reached out to you? Have they ever said sorry? Have they ever come by your house or picked up the phone and tried to call you and your husband?
No, and I learned recently that Adrian Gonzalez moved away from Uvalde pretty soon after, and now we know why. He knew he was wrong.
What is that like that these two men and so many of the others that were involved in this have never told you sorry or apologized?
I honestly have nothing to say to them and don't want to speak to them. There's nothing that they can say to right this wrong. As far as justice, that'll be for the rest of the world. That won't be for us. We lost our children. I'll never get my daughter back.
Yeah. I know the parents, and the last time I talked to you, I think was about a year ago, and you were talking to me about living in Uvalde and how difficult it was. And there have been tensions between people in the town and the parents who have been so unified, right, making sure that their children are never forgotten. What is the relationship like and the atmosphere like right now in Uvalde with you and the rest of the town?
A lot of tension still. Just this week, as information is released, the comments are, we don't want to hear about this anymore. It's time to move on. Prayers for our law enforcement. It is enraging.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that's like for you. As I mentioned, the parents, so many of the parents are unified in this. How do you want Uvalde and how do you want the country to remember Lexi and the other children that were involved?
I obviously want change in their honor. I want people to learn from Uvalde, but it is hard that our children paid the price for that. At the same time, I don't want their names just tied to what happened at Robb Elementary. I want their names tied to meaningful change.
Kimberly Matas Rubio, we thank you for joining Top Story for us tonight. We were always thinking about you and your daughter, Lexi, and thank you for coming on here and telling us how you feel on this very big, important day with these indictments.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back. Okay, back now with Top Story's news feed, and we start with the Biden administration shielding more than 300,000 Haitian migrants from deportation. Here's why. The new temporary protected status will apply to Haitians who arrived in the U.S. on or before June 3rd, including those who entered the country illegally. The move comes as rampant gang violence in Haiti continues. A 7.2 magnitude earthquake rocking the coast of Peru. Surveillance video, take a look, capturing a man in a bar running for cover as objects start to fall all around him. The quake also causing landslides. At least 8 people hurt. A tsunami alert was in effect but has since been canceled. And back here in the U.S., a critically endangered fish caught in New York's Hudson River. Look at this thing. Researchers holding up the 220-pound Atlantic sturgeon that was caught about 85 miles north of New York City. The rare 6-foot-long fish is the biggest fish in the Hudson River. Wildlife officials say it was released after being tagged and weighed. All right. Now to that announcement for Oklahoma schools. The state superintendent sending out a memo saying it's now mandatory for all public schools to have the Bible in classrooms and to teach it. This comes after Louisiana passed a law requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in classrooms. But are these mandates legal? NBC's Marissa Parra takes a look.
A new state requirement in Oklahoma means when students return to school in the fall, they'll have a Bible in their classroom. At least that's what State Superintendent Ryan Walters promised Thursday in a memo to Oklahoma State schools, saying effective immediately, all districts must comply.
Every teacher, every classroom in the state will have a Bible in the classroom, and we'll be teaching from the Bible.
The state attorney general's office questions the interpretation of the directive, saying there is no legal authority for a memo from the superintendent to require content, but that is not what the memo appears to do. But Walters doubles down.
They might need to look at it again, but it's pretty clear. It is required of all districts starting this year.
Reaction has been swift.
I wanted to be able to come here and thank Superintendent Walters.
While support for the move has been loud, so too has the backlash. Americans United for Separation of Church and State telling NBC News they're exploring options, saying in a statement, public schools are not Sunday schools. This is textbook Christian nationalism. Walters is abusing power of his public office to impose his religious beliefs on everyone else's children.
Is there any intention to basically create more Christians within the state of Oklahoma?
No, that's not the goal here of the of the act here. The goal is to have an accurate view of American history.
Walters also pushed back when asked if non-Christian students entering a classroom with Bibles will feel excluded.
We want all students to feel welcome in our schools. We want all kids to be successful in our schools. That being said, you don't change history because of your feelings.
That focus on history could also have an impact on the court, according to NBC legal analyst Angela Senadella.
I think that the historical intention behind it is definitely their strongest argument. I do think that it is a weak one, given the other parts of the test that the Supreme Court has administered in order to determine if there is a violation of the Establishment Clause.
The Establishment Clause, a part of the First Amendment that prevents the government from respecting an establishment of religion, also a topic of debate in Louisiana. where last week Governor Jeff Landry signed a law requiring the 10 Commandments be displayed in all public school classrooms by 2025. Civil rights groups already suing to try to block it on behalf of multi-faith families, setting up legal showdowns over church and state that could end up in front of the Supreme Court.
Frankly, there's always been this tension between the two clauses of the First Amendment of free exercise of religion versus the Establishment Clause. And this court, because they seem more amenable to moving in favor of free exercise and a little more against the Establishment Clause, that battle is just ripe for this court today.
Now, we asked the Oklahoma State Superintendent what the punishment would be for teachers who refuse to follow the Bible requirements in the fall. Tom, he said they could face losing their teaching license.
All right, that does it for us tonight. I'm Tom Llamas in New York. Stay right there. More news on the way.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.